tied to these wetlands. Louisiana has done a number of things to try to mitigate the possible disaster of the oil coming in, including opening the river diversions to their full extent and building berms off of our coast. And it's been somewhat controversial. Tell us briefly about the building of the berms. I mean, what do they look like and what are they supposed to do?
Well, the idea was that we'd build sand berms, you know, on top of our Barrier Islands or in front of the Barrier Islands to reduce the amount of oil coming inshore. The problem with that is that this was a very hastily dreamed up, you know, procedure, and it didn't have the scientific, you know, background in building it. These were sand berms about 6 feet high, essentially sand levees that would be built, and they were subject to the wave actions from hurricanes and you know, tropical storms, and the fear was that they would just be eroded away. But the biggest problem with building the sand berms is that it was using a sand resource that could have been used for legitimate Barrier Island restoration. We do need to restore our Barrier Islands, and everybody in Louisiana, all the scientific community supports Barrier Island restoration. But to build sand levees in the front of our Barrier Islands, you would have storm surges coming in, and to build sand berms takes a resource. They would harvest sand from where it is in the Gulf and deposit it on the Barrier Islands in the form of sand berms. And the wave actions from the hurricanes, storm surges, and whatever would disperse the sand all over, you know, the internal estuary, and it would no longer be available for legitimate Barrier Island restoration. That was the biggest fear. They were very costly. We built 5 miles of berm at a cost of $180 million. We restored Timberlayer Island, for example, pre-Hurricane Katrina for $12 million at about 5 miles of that Barrier Island. So they were very expensive, and we don't know how much good they did.
Yeah. Well, you know, they've been very controversial, and the governor, it's been widely reported that the governor and other community leaders have called for building the berms and continuing the construction. At the same time that it's been widely reported that the scientific community is not supporting it, as you have just suggested. Why do those community leaders want to build these berms?
Well, that was a feeling that they had to do something. You know, everybody was concerned about the oil coming in Louisiana, and they had to do something. And the perception was that they would stop the oil from coming in, when the reality was they didn't at all. I mean, you build a sand berm on the front of the Barrier Island, or you don't have that sand berm, and the oil hits the Barrier Island. So what's the deal? You cleaning up oil off sand either way. Right. So the usefulness of the sand berms was questionable.
Right. And the scientific community is opposed because?
Because it was an enormous waste of resource.
Yeah. Yeah. And also there's science. There's concerns about the science of the construction as well.
Well, the whole shape. The shape of the berms was in the form of a levee. And the shape of the Barrier Island is not in the form of a levee. It gradually slopes. And, you know, the shape was all wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's that has caused quite a controversy in our state and beyond, because it pits community leaders who are there to help the public against the scientific community that's been out there for decades working on these issues. So it's unfortunate. You know, regarding the diversions on the river, tell us what the Davis Pond Diversion Project is, and give the audience a feel for what river diversions are about.
Well, the Davis Pond diversion was actually thought of as a way to help oyster production. It has a maximum of 10,000 cubic feet per second of flow. It flows river water from the river, Mississippi River, into Lake Catawatchee. And the operation of Davis Pond is governed by a 5 parts per thousand line, which is down near Little Lake, down into the system. It's about where the 5 part per thousand line was in 1956. When the saltwater line at Little Lake becomes greater than 5 parts per thousand, they would release more water. So it was meant to introduce sediments and nutrients into the marshes to restore some of that hydrology that we lost over the years. And it was meant to do so in a way that we could still maintain oyster production. Oysters do need salt water to survive, and several estuarine species need salt water to survive and grow. But Davis Pond, there's a perception that you would fill the system with fresh water and create a positive flow and keep the oil out. Mm-hmm. But in Louisiana, we have a very weak tidal system. It's dominated by winds. Wind direction has everything to do with stacking up water in our internal system. So the release of maximum flow 10,000 CFS water from the river ended up killing oysters at a critical time of year, the time they were spawning. And the success at keeping oil out was very questionable. In my opinion, it did nothing to keep the oil out of the internal estuary.
Yeah, well, that was my follow-up question, was is it being effective with the oil, and you say no.
No, there's no question. There's a perception that the positive flow would keep the oil out, but mm-hmm. It's too far up in the system to impact the passes.
Yeah. Have there been any unintended consequences that you haven't mentioned yet from opening, at maximum capacity?
Well, it's killed a lot of oysters. We did oyster surveys, about 3 weeks ago, and all the oysters are dead in the upper half of Barataria Bay all the way up. And the concern there is that there won't be any spawning success to generate new oysters for the following years, next year and the years after that.
Yeah. What's your opinion on Dr. Marty McConnell at the University of New Orleans' assertion that had we had these restoration programs in place for decades, that we would have a healthy barrier island system?
I agree totally with that. We need land. The land loss area in Louisiana is critical. We've lost so much land that the communities are at risk. Salt water is encroaching into fresh water. We need to rebuild land masses.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
Well, we recently traveled to Louisiana to visit several state and private universities where scientists are studying the impacts of oil on the different habitats in the Gulf of Mexico and on the interconnectivity of the food web. Let's see what those scientists have to say.
The optimists say that, well, the oil is gone, and we don't see it in the water column anymore. And then it turns up in a bottom layer. And some of the folks before this bottom layer was discovered say, well, the bacteria have worked exceptionally fast. It's just gone. We still don't really know. We don't know what the condition of that settled layer is. Is it largely degraded? Is it toxic? Are all the lightweight components out of it, the things that could likely be toxic? We don't know.
So there was that immediate oil hitting the shore, but a lot of that oil that's on the surface is now gone. Gone where? It's a really good question. But part of the answer is that some of it is still out there in the environment. It's lying on the bottom. And it's lying on the bottom close to coastlines. And so even though this initial surface oil has disappeared, we might think that the initial exposure has disappeared, But what's really important to keep in mind is that future storm events are going to resuspend some of that oil back into the water column and re-expose some beaches and some marsh habitats. And any critters that are burrowing down into that sand or burrowing down into the sediment of marshes where some of this oil is stored are going to be continuously exposed over a long period of time.
Speaking and hearing about some of the scientists who worked with the Exxon Valdez in Alaska, especially with their herring problem, and what the situation there was, this species was a commercial species doing fairly well. Right after the oil spill, a cohort came back. The next 3 or 4 years, everything seemed fine. But then later on, they stopped showing up, and then the problem started 4 or 5 years after the situation. And that's what we might be looking at here. We're not going to see an extirpation like we saw in Alaska. It's a different system altogether. But we have commercial species that have probably been impacted at the larval stage. They are not going to be around here in 4 or 5 years. We need to realize that. We need to kind of point out ways to mitigate that and long-term effects. And again, people say oil out of sight, out of mind. This is something that's going to be long-term, unfortunately, here in Mississippi and in southeast Louisiana.
You know, when you look at the ocean and you look at the obvious products that come from it, you see great big fish and you see great big lobsters and big crabs and big shrimps, and that's what you see in the market. But there's an awful lot of background to this that you must understand in terms of how that gets there. How does it grow up? Where does it reproduce? What does it feed upon? What kind of habitat does it live in? They have these life histories that utilize all these different levels, and so they exemplify that it's all interconnected. You can't talk about that fish unless you're talking about the algae on the bottom in terms of, is there a good environment in which that fish can grow up in?
Well, I'm studying the diversity of the marine algae or the seaweed. So what I'm interested in is looking at what's out there in the Gulf of Mexico. And also now with that oil spill is how the oil spill could have affected the number of species and the quality of the species that was there before. So what is so important about the organisms I'm studying is for the whole ecosystem of the Gulf, for the vitality of the Gulf, is that they are the primary producers, meaning they are the ones that produce the oxygen. And we all know if there is no oxygen, the whole rest of the ecosystem is going to go berserk, basically. So that's why it's so important to have the algae that are healthy and not being affected by negative effects of the oil, etc., to really make sure that they can produce the oxygen and that the rest of the Gulf stays healthy.
But a lot of our questions about whether or not this is going to create a hypoxic or an anoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico and beyond hinges on how much oil originally came out, how fast is it moving and mixing with the water mass and with other sources of carbon, and how long is it taking for that oil to biodegrade. In terms of landed oil, again, one of the fascinating things that we've noticed through our sampling is that the sampling is, or where oil is washing up, is very spatially heterogeneous. That's a fancy way of saying it's splotchy. You can be in one marsh and you can find oil up to your ankles, literally, and you can go a few miles away and not find a trace of the oil. So it's interesting how it's been transported from fairly far offshore into these sensitive ecosystems, and how natural currents have and wind patterns have cordoned it into certain areas and kept other areas relatively oil clean.
So it seems like the event is over, and it's over for a lot of people that make their living here. But they make their living on the organisms that live in a lot of these marshes, or at least the ecosystem health is what supports a lot of this economy. And the effects on ecosystem health, I don't think we've seen those yet. Those haven't emerged yet.
The fears that folks have about, will I see those communities come back that I've grown to depend upon being there, whether I simply go to the restaurant to eat them or whether I'm out there as a scuba diver or a fisherman enjoying that community for a variety of other reasons, will those be there again? I think we're going to be able to shed some light on that very soon.